My first student we're going to have up here is Hannah Scott, and she's going to be talking to you about an exhibit, which is a hard thing to do because the exhibit is three-dimensional and out there in the lobby. So she's going to show you a PowerPoint of her exhibit that she's presented, that she didn't have to do a PowerPoint for the CADIC for the competition, but she's created a PowerPoint for tonight just to show you the process she went through to create her gold medal award-winning exhibit. So Hannah, if you could come to the stage, please.
To save the culture of your allies is a small thing. To cherish the culture of your enemy, to risk your life and the life of other men to save it, to give it all back to them as soon as the battle was won, it was unheard of, but that is exactly what the Monuments Men intended to do. This quote by Robert Edsel, who founded the Monuments Men Foundation, perfectly sums up how the Monuments Men took a stand for cultural preservation during World War II. There were 345 men and women who volunteered to go serve in Europe in order to identify cultural heritage sites that were damaged and to help save artwork that was taken by the Nazis. And because of their leadership in this aspect, it has affected cultural preservation today and is still extremely relevant with destruction in Syria and modern warfare. So the beginning of my topic starts out in 1937, and during this time the Nazis were rising to power, and they began to start discriminating in the art world. In 1937, they confiscated 16,000 Jewish-created modern and abstract artworks in Germany, and they condemned them in what was known as a Degenerate Art Exhibition. And the picture on the bottom left shows this exhibition. And if you notice, there's pictures hanging crooked on the walls, covered in spray paint, and this was purposeful by the Nazis to try to show how these works were inferior and not worthy of being displayed in a proper museum. On the right-hand side, there are abstract artworks in contrast to people with facial deformities, and the Nazis would distribute propaganda of this kind to try to show how this artwork was inferior as well. Because the Nazis had this idea that art was inferior and they could discriminate which art was worthy of being saved and which was worthy of being destroyed, it led to contrasting viewpoints between the Nazis and the United States, and this led to disagreements about the fate of art in war, what's going to happen to all these historic works that are in Europe. And so the Nazis took the stance that they were going to plunder and destroy and just get rid of everything that they could that was of historic significance. Whereas the United States and General Eisenhower took the stance that they recognized they were going to be encountering many historic works as they invaded Europe, and that they felt it was their responsibility to guard these works and their obligation to help save these works for future generations. They also saw them as man's past achievements, and they wanted to save them from the tide of ruin that was engulfing Europe. So because the Nazis took the stance of wanting to purify the art in Europe, they had three main motives that they used when they were looting Europe. So as they invaded countries, they started looting, and they ended up confiscating over 5,000 items, or 5 million, which is kind of hard to imagine. So the picture in the bottom right is of the Louvre Museum, and that's empty frames. So the Nazis took more artwork than the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as two other of the world's biggest museums can hold. And so then they would use this art. They intended to destroy some of it, to use it to gift to party bosses like Hitler and Göring. And then Hitler also had a plan to build a Führer museum. And in the bottom left is Hitler with a scale model of this museum he intended to build. And he wanted to build it as a tribute to himself and to highlight the proper culture of Europe and what that should look like. So the United States responded to this by creating the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Division in 1943. And they were tasked with the protection, preservation, and restitution, where necessary, of religious, historic, and artistic works in Europe. So as I said, there were 345 individuals, and they were up against 5 million items. And these items were all across Europe. It's a very large area for them to try to handle. And these gentlemen were assigned to individual units, and so they were not one big group. They were one man here and one man there. And originally their task as they were in Europe was to post off-limits bulletins on buildings or to survey damage of those that had already been targeted and destroyed. And they would also create bombing maps to identify important sites, such as in the top right, And they would identify historic sites that should be avoided during bombing raids. And they started their work soon after D-Day, which is pretty late in the war, so they were already way behind on trying to help preserve these artworks. So they faced a monumental task as they were trying to preserve Europe's cultural heritage. As the Allies approached Germany, they discovered over 1,000 repositories, and these contained the contents of Europe's museums, churches, and private collections. So these show different repositories and artwork that was in them. In the bottom left is Hermann Göring's part of his collection with a bunch of statues from the Louvre. The bottom right is the Odessa salt mine, and this is what I modeled my exhibit after, a salt mine. And these were an ideal location to store paintings because they had a constant temperature and they were safe from bombing raids. And the ladder in that picture in the right is 9 feet tall, and this is one chamber of one mine. So the scale of the artwork that was stored there is quite impressive. In the top right is a depot with church bells, and there are over 5,000 church bells in that location. And those are the ones that had not been melted down for scrap metal yet. So there are countless others that were destroyed. The MFAA faced a lot of obstacles while they were trying to evacuate items, and they used ingenuity to overcome these. So whenever they were understaffed, they would recruit civilian assistants. They would also, whenever they would lack packing resources, they would wrap the paintings in fur coats. And then whenever they would have inadequate transportation, they would hitchhike and try to find a way to get to these different locations. Another obstacle that the MFAA faced was opposition from German propaganda, and I thought this excerpt from a German radio broadcast perfectly illustrated what they were up against. So like hyenas, the Anglo-American barbarians in the occupied Western territories are falling upon German works of art and beginning a systematic looting campaign. Under flimsy pretext, all private houses and public buildings in the whole area are searched by art experts, most of them Jews, who confiscate all works of art. So the Nazis would distribute propaganda like this, and the MFA had to work to prove they were really trying to help and try to help save Europe's cultural heritage. And the MFAA also faced doubt from their own army. There were high-up leaders who believed that trying to help civilize war was impossible. It's not something that could be done. And they also felt that they shouldn't have to go out of their way to help save a historic building because it would make a military operation more difficult. So whenever the MFAA would evacuate items from repositories, they would take them to collecting points. And at collecting points, they would identify them, which was often a very difficult task because they had transferred hands multiple times throughout the war and were not documented properly. And whenever they would evacuate these works from repositories, they would use pulley systems like on the left to get them out of mines, and that's the Madonna and Child statue. And then on the right is a Rembrandt painting, and they used mine carts. They would haul them out that way. So not only did the MFAA take a stand to preserve Europe's cultural heritage, they took a stand to return the items to their proper owners and not just keep the items for the victors. The MFAA protested whenever 202 items were scheduled to be shipped to the United States, and it was the only act of protest by military officers during World War II. And in that, they declared that they felt the artwork that belonged to Germans was just as important as the artwork that belonged to the French people or anyone in Europe. So they took a stand to return the German-owned works of art. And that was a very difficult task because you're returning the artwork that belonged to your enemy, but they recognized that their heritage was just as important as ours. In the right-hand side is artwork, a piece of work being returned to a city in Italy, and they had a huge celebration because it was so important to them for that work to be returned. My topic has several neat connections to Kansas City history. The three gentlemen on the left, Paul Gardner, Lawrence Sickman, and Patrick Heller, they were leaders at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, and they all became directors or prominent people and helped to establish the Nelson Atkins as we know it today. And then the painting on the right is Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. And this painting has a pretty interesting story of its journey from Europe to Kansas City, where it is today. It belonged to the Rothschild family in Europe, and then the Nazis confiscated it and took it to the Odessa salt mine. And then in 1945, the Monuments men rescued it and returned it to the Rothschild family. And the Rothschilds later sold it, and Paul Gardner, who worked at the Nelson Atkins, bought the piece to come back to Kansas City. So a monuments-man helped save the work, and then he was able to bring it back to his museum, which I think is a really neat connection to our local history. The MFAA has been honored in recent years. There was a long gap in history where they were not recognized. They were overshadowed in the history of World War II. And so in 2015, the remaining gentlemen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, and that's them at the ceremony in Washington, D.C. And today there's the Monuments Men Foundation, and Robert Edsel is who founded that. And the Monuments Men Foundation works to honor the legacy of the MFAA and also to help bring home the items that are still missing today. There are over 100,000 pieces of artwork and cultural items that are missing from World War II, and they're still being discovered to this day. Just last week, there was another painting that was returned to Austria, and there's countless articles about like a tapestry from Hitler's eagle's nest or pieces being returned in the last year. So it's still an ongoing effort to identify pieces of art and return them to their proper owners. The mission also continues today for the Monuments Men with destruction in the Middle East. This map shows nationally recognized cultural heritage sites in Syria and ones that have been destroyed in the magnitude of the destruction. And so, as you can see, a lot of different places have been destroyed there. And so, it's being addressed in several ways today. This is Corinne Wegener, and she is a modern-day monuments woman. Her official title is a Cultural Heritage Preservation Officer. And I was able to interview her for my project back in April. I talked to her while she was in Washington, D.C., and I figured out that she's actually from Lexington, Missouri. So it was kind of neat talking to her in D.C. I'm back in Odessa. And so she works for the Smithsonian. I was able to meet her while I was in D.C. And in 2003, she went to Baghdad and helped to rescue over 1,000 items from their museum while it was being destroyed. And so she was a really neat lady to meet, and I enjoyed getting to interview her. And she also helped to show me how my topic is still so relevant today and how the lessons from the MFAA are still applied to our history. I was also able to interview Robert Edsel, and he was a little bit difficult to contact because he's filming a documentary in Europe, but I talked to him through email. He is who wrote the Monuments Men book, which later inspired the Monuments Men movie. And in my interview, he talked about he's interviewed 23 Monuments Men. And so he had a lot of knowledge he could share, and he's traveled all around the country researching this subject, so he was a wealth of information. And then he also sent me a copy of the Monuments Men book that he signed, and that's out there next to my exhibit. So to give you an idea of the actual creation of my exhibit, this was my first rough draft of my project. And the research process goes from about September, October, clear until March whenever I have to have an exhibit, and then I'll continue revising it. But this was one of my first rough drafts with just pictures that are up there trying to figure out where they belong. And I use my secondary sources and primary sources to try to continue revise that and to write the script. And so eventually you get the final product, which is my exhibit. I modeled my exhibit after the Odessa salt mine, so I used hanging caged lights that were identical to ones in a picture from the mine that I found. And then I used a textured background to create the rocky effect like a mine, and rocks to create a mine entrance sign. In the center, I also wanted to highlight the Monuments Men and how they saved significant works of art that we would recognize, such as the Mona Lisa. So I displayed the Monuments Men holding artworks in the middle photograph, the picture frame, and then used smaller picture frames to show other prominent pieces of works they saved. And then at the base of my exhibit, I also have 2 Life magazines that show articles from that time period. So the Monuments Men have a legacy that is very varied, but it's still very relevant to our history today, and their legacy is still influencing cultural heritage preservation and how we handle cultural destruction during armed conflict. So I really enjoyed researching this project this year. So, thank you.